All right, hello everyone. Today we have Alex Krupp on the podcast. Alex is a CEO and co-founder of Forward Everyone, a platform that helps you read, share, search, and discover useful email chains. He is also an author of Pretty Forward, which we'll talk about later. Alex, do you have anything else to tell about yourself?
No, that's pretty much it. I mean, I guess for me, about how I came to this, like my background, like I studied kind of business and marketing in college and did that for a couple of years after graduating. And then only later started getting, more into programming in Django.
Okay. That's interesting. Okay, so we're a Django podcast. So we can start with some of the Django things. As you mentioned, you were doing like a business degree. So you decided to learn it while college or afterwards, to build your specific project. How did you come about learning?
A few years after, actually. So I graduated from college in 2008. And I think when I was in college, I took a couple CS classes and I was always interested in getting more into coding. But at the time, web development was just like a lot harder than it is now. I mean, at the same time, there was like also like a lot less business advice like on the web than there is now. So it was, I think, much more than today. Like you really had to pick one over the other. So I kind of focused on business. But then a few years later, after the advent of Stack Overflow and blogging and everything else, it became more obvious that like most people should just know and understand, if not be great at both. So that's how I started getting more deep into like tech and Django, and that was like 2012 that I started going in that direction.
So you would right now you would consider yourself more on the programming side or on the business side?
Both. I would say I've been doing more programming for the last 5 years, especially more than 5 years now, actually. But yeah.
Cool. So when you started learning it, what were your challenges? Was it easy, hard, with Django specifically?
Django specifically. So I think the Django documentation was pretty good even in 2012. Like I think the first version I used was like 1.4, where I'm pretty sure custom user models had just been added. That was like the big feature. And yeah, I think the biggest challenge was just with Python. There were still things with Python that I didn't know or understand. I think just some of the syntax was like it's one thing to learn the syntax reading the Python documentation, but then to actually recognize like in the wild, oh, this is a class or this is or whatever. We're like Django, just even though like it's not a very magical framework, it can feel magical if you don't like if you're not like immediately recognizing like what Python structures things are and like how it works at a Python level. So that took a little while, and I think there were things in the like the tutorial was very good, but then going from the tutorial to the rest of it, definitely at first like it took me a while. Like I just wasn't efficient at like understanding the documentation for.
Oh, I totally get it.
So it would be frustrating, and it was like, cause I think that's the hardest thing about learning to code, just getting to the point where you can like really just understand the documentation yourself.
I totally resonate with this because when I was learning Django, I don't think Django was the official documentation that I started with. It was probably Will Vincent. He has some good tutorials on Django. It's a couple of books, and then with months, I look at documentation and then I can actually read something, what arguments to use or what it does, and then actually it is a joy when you understand it. So I totally resonate with you on this one. Do you remember what was the turning point? Because you're saying it was because you didn't have much Python experience by then, and it was somewhat hard learning new thing. And then at what point you kind of tipping point where you didn't get discouraged, but rather you were like, okay, cool, I'm sticking with this. It's much easier now.
Yeah. So for me, the way I started learning it was I was actually trying to make like my current site like for everyone back in 2012. I mean, it turned out the technology to do it just wasn't there yet and wouldn't really exist for a couple more years. And I also realized that I just wasn't ever like going to be good enough in the near future to actually build the site in like a good way. But however, my initial idea was just to get good enough to make like a minimum viable product and then find a technical co-founder. I mean, I actually ended up getting better than I thought I would. So I ended up taking a job as a developer and figured like, why not get paid to get better at this? So I spent a couple of years like working full-time as a developer, actually. Yeah, partly because I wanted to get better, and partly because I like, even though like I had like a business background and have some good business related stuff on my resume, I was finding it easier to get like good jobs as a developer with zero development experience than to get like good business jobs with a pretty decent like business background. So it's kind of like, okay, like maybe I should give this a try. Yeah. So and after a couple of years, like I got a lot better essentially. Like the first 6 months of my first job, I was basically convinced I was gonna get fired like every single day, and but would go home like after every day and just basically just teach myself for another 5 or 6 hours like after work. And eventually after 6 months, I started getting the hang of it, and then took a second job after a year and learned even more stuff, and went back to Forward Everyone a couple of years later after Google released like a new Gmail API essentially that sort of made it possible to do what I was originally looking to do. And by the time I jumped back into it, it was like it was much smoother sailing.
Did you do any interesting projects when you were learning? Because you mentioned that the Forward project was not possible at the time. So did you do anything else fun?
So I was still working on Forward Everyone, even though it wasn't so like the sticking point at the time, or at least like the biggest sticking point, it was like very important to me that like the emails people share, whether publicly or privately, should like actually be authentic. I mean, there just wasn't really a good way to authenticate them at the time. So it's like you could have people copy and paste emails onto a website, but it's then anyone can just make up any email conversation. So where it kind of like the magic of it got lost under that model for me. So yeah, so I did spend several months working on that before I realized that was like a big sticking point. And then after, I was mostly teaching myself like AngularJS at the time and JavaScript, and I wasn't really building anything like using Angular or JS, or I think jQuery I learned during that time. I think those were maybe more Python, I don't know. But yeah, so it was like reading a lot of books, but not necessarily, and taking like very detailed notes on the books, but not necessarily building things so much outside of work at that point. I think just coding for work all day, every day anyway. So there wasn't like a huge need.
So you mentioned you were learning, JavaScript and some of the front end stuff at the same time. What was easier for you? What was more natural?
That's a good question. I think, well, JavaScript, I guess it was easier in some ways just because like I had already learned Python. But at the same time, like there's a lot of JavaScript stuff that's just like super weird, even to this day, where it's like I do a pretty decent amount of JavaScript. But even today, there's stuff where it's like, I remember what the gotcha, like I remember the keyword this, there's 4 different things it can do depending on the context, but I still don't know. It's just like when I see code involving this, like I need to actually, look up like what the thing is binding to depending on the context. So, and like, I know like I know all the weird quirks like that, but because it's, even though I do it a lot, it's not like I'm doing it all day. So there's certain things that are like weird there for me even to this day.
The reason I ask is because I started with a backend, so with Django, and HTML and CSS came slowly, but I started understanding all the Flex stuff, how to position everything. And then JavaScript, I'm trying to learn it again, just pure vanilla JavaScript, and it's like 5th time for me, and I could never get it. I think just because I got so much better with Python, I can actually understand some of the things that's happening in the JavaScript, as you mentioned, but just find it confusing. I always thought, front end is cool just because that's what people see. But then once I actually started learning it, like back end is just simpler. It's more introverted. So for me, you just do stuff on the server and everything's nice. Okay.
That's fair. I think the JavaScript book I like the most is JavaScript à l'Angers by Reginald Braithwaite, I think. And it just teaches JavaScript from first principles. So it explains how JavaScript is like secretly a functional language. And that I found that like super useful and just a lot of fun to read. So yeah, if you're teaching yourself again anyway.
Thank you.
Check it out.
And regarding Django, so if say we have users who visit the website, they saw all the cool stuff people built with Django and they want to start learning, do you have any advice for those people?
Yeah, I think the tutorial's really good, actually. I think the hardest thing, honestly, is like learning what you don't need to know, because there's so much stuff both in Django and Python and the Django REST framework or whatever else libraries you want to use that like a lot of it is not only do you not need to know it, but like a lot of it is like stuff that you really don't want to use, frankly. And as a beginner, you don't have like a good sense of what that is. So it's just easy to get sucked into wasting a lot of time on stuff like that. So the example I like is when I was learning Python, like I just had no concept of what to learn or not learn. So I remember spending like several days like reading the documentation on like frozen sets. And like, which in retrospect was just having been doing this for 10 years now. Like I've never once used a frozen set. It's like complete waste of time other than knowing that it's like, how was I supposed to know that? It's like the same thing where there's so many different string formatting methods in Python now. And like a lot of them you really just don't want to use. As a beginner, like it's easy to get caught up and like spend multiple weeks like learning stuff, like learning string formatting stuff that you shouldn't even be using in the first place. Yeah, I don't have a good solution other than maybe get a job and like other people for advice. And yeah,
maybe it's actually a good idea, because you mentioned that as a beginner learning, you don't know many people who know it very well, so you don't know what to learn. So maybe having a resource, so you know what you should learn, what you should focus on, what's the most important thing.
And with Python and Django, there's like really good meetups also where people are super helpful in like most major cities. So
that's true.
I think it's like a little bit easier than most other technical stacks. So that's one of the real advantages, actually.
I love Python. Apparently you can do, I started it because I was econ and math, and then I was doing it for data analysis, because I thought that's what it was made for. And then later on, web development, Django, cool. Then I'm seeing you can make, apps for Mac with Python. It's just crazy. It's so versatile.
Yeah, people say it's like the second best language for everything, which I think is the first is like whatever specific language for your use case. So like for web development and data science or whatever, it might be completely different, or game development. But for me, like wanting to do startups, like that's the reason I chose it, essentially, because it's, as a startup, you don't really know what you're going to build or how you're going to make money. And with Python, no matter what the answer is, like you can do it with Python, whereas like a lot of other languages, like you don't necessarily have that flexibility or the third-party libraries or whatever. Yeah, for me, that was like why I went that direction.
That totally makes sense. So once you mentioned forward everyone, let's talk about it a little more. So right now, is it your full-time project? You're fully dedicated to it?
Yeah, it has been for the last couple of years, yes.
Very interesting. So you don't have like full-time job as a developer or anything like that?
Not right now. So I had, for a little while before that, I'd been alternating between doing consulting and just working on this, essentially. But then I started going, and like I really wanted to keep doing that, but then I got pushed more towards working on this full time, just because a couple of years ago, like Google announced some new security policies for anything using like the Gmail API and like a lot of their other APIs, actually, that it basically necessitated either paying like tens of thousands of dollars a year for a security assessment, or else rewriting a lot of the software to use different APIs. So it's just economically, it just wasn't gonna work to be paying like tens of thousands of dollars a year for something that was like a hobby project. So I just had to make a decision and decided to go for it, essentially.
Okay. When you started it, it was, I think you mentioned it was 2014, roughly, right?
So I think my co-founder and I started working part-time some of the weekends in 2015. Oh no, it was 2014, fall of 2014, and then we went full-time briefly in July 2015, and then kind of launched like it wasn't even viable. I call it like an MVP, but like in retrospect, it was not really viable, I think, in the spring of 2016. So
really, because I was just going to ask how long it took you to get to an MVP, if you will. So you have two versions of MVP, a non-real MVP and a real MVP.
Yeah, so to initially launch something, so it was like around, I want to say, a year and a quarter of full-time work for each of us. Yeah, that's about right. And then, but like the initial thing just didn't really work at all. Like we did like a show Hacker News post, but and launched on product hunt, but really didn't even promote it beyond that because it didn't really work. So there's not much point getting users if every time they try to do the one thing they're supposed to do, it just like breaks. And also there were like a lot of other issues. Like it didn't work on mobile at all when we launched. And it was just like, so and it kind of, there were just like a couple of years of we'd talk to potential users and be like, why aren't you using this? And they tell us things like I don't have a computer, I only use the internet from my phone and it doesn't work on my phone. Oh, that seems like a legitimate reason. Actually, maybe we should like work on that. Why aren't you using this? And they're like, you can only share email publicly, but what if I want to see what it looks like before I share it with all my friends? And we're like, oh, that also seems legitimate. And it was like, and then it's if I share stuff publicly, I want lots of people to read it, and you guys don't have any users. So we're like, oh, well, what if we made it so that you can embed email within Reddit posts and Medium posts, so that way like you could leverage all of their traffic without us needing millions of users. And so it's just like very iterative where
well, that's perfect because you were talking to your clients and then acting upon their recommendations. And it took you roughly, you said, till 2016 to get something working?
Well, so the thing we launched in 2016 wasn't working. Okay. It was just like public. To get something working, like actually with good engagement, like only in the last 6 months, we're actually getting good engagement now. I think it's still not like a super successful business by any means, but it's gone from like the trough of sorrow to like the wiggles of false hope stage, if you're familiar with the Y Combinator model.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that's interesting. Like now, like in like we'd always been doing like a little bit of prospecting, but it was like we'd send out like a few hundred emails, like asking various people if they wanted to use the product or whatever we were saying, and we were like getting a bunch of feedback, but like not a lot of people who wanted to use it, or else people who wanted to use it, but like even people who wanted to use it, like they just found themselves like unable to actually use it for various reasons, which kind of necessitated us just going back to working on the product essentially, but also made a few shifts over the years with like our initial customer base and stuff like that. There's like, so in the startup world, there's two different schools of thought that are like diametrically opposed. One is you should always be like selling all the time, and if you're not like selling every day, like you're not a real business, it's just like a vanity project. Then like the other school of thought is that like engagement is the most important thing, and until you have like good engagement and retention, then there's no point in doing growth because it's just you're just pouring water into a sieve essentially. So like we definitely very heavily into focusing on getting good engagement, which we've finally seems to be working. Yeah, now we're going back to in the other direction and actually like doing selling, which is, and it's actually going better now, which is
something
a lot more fun.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a lot more fun when people like are excited about the thing you're building. So, but yeah.
So I mentioned. Oh, sorry. I noticed that first of all, the second Hacker News show. Was an accidental one, I believe. Someone else posted it for you.
Yeah, it was an accidental. It wasn't us who posted it. Yeah, so I don't know who it was. I think it was someone I met at a meetup, but I'm actually not sure. Or I think someone I met at a meetup told one of their friends, or I don't know what the deal was. But yeah, so
it got a lot of traction. There was a lot of comments, a lot of controversial. Some people were angry, as per usual.
Yeah, that was like the best thing to do, because like the first time we did the show Hacker News, it just got like completely ignored pretty much, and then the second time, like people were actually angry enough. Oh, we're making progress.
Yeah.
And it's actually funny because it's always had that reaction. So when we started working on it, it was like before the Sony email hacks. It was before the Hillary Clinton email things. It was before like all this, like all of these scandals. It was also before like Techlash, where people just lost faith in Facebook and Google and all these other companies. Amazon. So yeah, I think it's been weird in that environment, but even from the very beginning, like it was like very polarizing. Like this is like before we even had the product, when we were just going to meetups and talking to people, but still, so I guess in like 2015, where I just remember there were like a couple people like, we're like, yeah, we're making this site where anyone can take like an email conversation and publish it on the internet. And some people were like, wow, that's like an amazing idea. And other people literally just got super angry, and one person just started crying. It was like really weird, but yeah, I don't know.
Okay. And your product hunt was pretty successful as well. I guess there was no so much, product hunt seems to be a little nicer in that sense, so there was no crazy arguments going on. But what I wanted to ask is any learnings you can share from both of those launches? Anything that comes to mind?
Very little, honestly. I think obviously like it's a lot of fun to be on like Hacker News and Product Hunt, but at the same time, for 99% of businesses, like those aren't like your customers.
I guess that's true, yeah.
So if you can get them like beta testing it and like finding bugs or something, like that's like great. But for most people, like they'd be pretty lucky to even get that. But there are exceptions. Like there are like obviously Dropbox is like the canonical example of a company that was like a show HN and then became like a $10 billion thing. But most companies aren't like that. They're just, first of all, it these days it's like very hard to even get like your show HN featured on the front page of Hacker News. Mm-hmm. And even if you do, it's more of a vanity thing and not like a marketing.
That's good. That's totally true. Say. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So let's talk some numbers if you are comfortable with. So how many users does email forward everyone has right now?
A few hundred. It's like very small.
Okay.
There were, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. There were like a few hundred people who signed up with the first iteration of the technology, and then within the last couple of years, like rebuilt the tech. And the new technology finally got approved by Google less than a year ago, like in the last 6 to 9 months.
That's good.
And yeah, and then since then, I was basically spent about 6 months doing like special projects with it. So like I was doing like a lot of stuff using our software to benefit the Andrew Yang campaign, like for president, mm-hmm. which was super useful, just like dog fooding our own product and like finding a lot of like some bugs, but more just like features where it's like, to actually use this for something real, like it needs like X, Y, and Z. We had been documenting the product like for our own needs for a while, but to actually be working with the campaign and like a few other larger users like that, and to be doing things that they were asking for, service like a lot of like useful learnings like I used to improve the product.
I've got to say, sorry, no, continue.
Oh yeah, so then maybe partly because of the product improvements, but also partly randomly, like the engagement started getting validated. There's people who have actually been using it like not every day, but every week, like multiple times a week. And then at the same time, there was like some email threads that were posted about coronavirus recently that got like tens of thousands of page views and were linked to from like Asia Times, Financial Times, like the front page of Yahoo News, like really helped to validate. And people were like super excited, and there were like dozens, if not hundreds of tweets about it. So validating that people actually like the experience of reading the threads. And then, you know, like a reasonable percentage of people who are reading the threads were actually signing up and making accounts. Mm-hmm. So not all of those people were actually using the product. Most were not, but still like that kind of, I guess separately, almost like the people using it for business use internally was validated. The readership aspect was validated, like the engagement I'm pretty sure was validated. So all of the pieces of the life cycle have been like separately validated at this point. So that's how I've been making the transition to actually focus on selling it. So yeah.
I can only see it going up. As you mentioned, people share because it has an innate kind of sharing quality. So the point is that you share, and when you share, other people read it, and so they're more likely to share as well. And then you can spread. Hopefully, that's how it's going to go. The first time you published the project on Built with Django, I obviously checked it out. I didn't go into detail. I just looked at it from far. And just okay, that's pretty cool. I'm just starting to wonder how you did it. And then second time around, maybe a couple of weeks later, I decided to look at it again. And then I missed the tutorials the first time I saw it. Mm-hmm. And then the second time with the video explaining and then some more detailed explanations, it was very well done. The instructions were very good. And then they're talking about the use cases very well so that I can immediately think, okay, what can I use it for and how it can be used? So that's done very well. And if you don't mind me asking, did you hire someone to do that or also try to do it yourself?
No, I did it myself. My wife helped a lot though. She's a film and video teacher, and it's her voice in the current version of the tutorials. So yeah, and I wrote the scripts and I did the screencast, but then she edited it and did the voiceovers and did all the timing to make sure the voice lined up with the images and stuff. So that's how they were created. A lot of them actually need to be redone now, but I really hate making the tutorials. So
no, I can imagine. It's not quick and easy. It's not like coding where you're gonna, change something and then you can see the results straight away. It's a long project, so yeah, I totally understand.
They were incredibly painful to make. Like even though each one's 2 or 3 minutes, like it took a very long time. Essentially, yeah, it's like 10 hours per minute of video.
10 hours. Oof.
Something to write the scripts and
so just from your side, and then plus whatever your wife did with the editing, and then wow.
Because you need to record it again and again, and there would be things like I'd accidentally like the tabs would be like in a different place between cuts, or like the bookmark bar would be like open or closed. So or it would be in like the incognito window, so the browser would be like a different color. So there kept being these continuity issues, and then all sorts of stuff with the vocals, and yeah, it was just such a pain.
That's painful. That sounds very, very painful. I hope the second time around it goes easier, and then we'll see.
Yeah, some of them are still fine, but yeah, there's a couple things that have changed.
If you don't mind me asking, so do you have a revenue going in from the customers using, or it's currently totally free? And what's your plan on kind of business model?
Yeah, so there's like a small amount of revenue, not enough to live off, in the like few $100s a month basically. But it's the business model is basically, and this is what it's always been, even before we built it, like that it's completely free to share stuff publicly, but to share stuff privately within your company, it costs, a few dollars per user per month. In our case, we're charging $16 per user per month. So yeah, that's the model. Essentially, the theory is that sharing stuff publicly gets us users and makes us rank higher in Google and like all of that. So hopefully, in the long term, we'll get more users to the site who will then make business accounts. So yeah, it's basically the exact same business model as GitHub, which really was the inspiration. I think when we were talking about it back in 2014, 2015, we were talking about, should this be paid or should this be advertising supported? My thought was really like, it takes 10 years to build a business, and at least. And in 10 years, if like self-driving cars really put like a third of Americans out of work, then who's going to have money to buy stuff that's like being advertised? So that's not really, maybe that won't come to fruition or whatever, but that wasn't really like a business model that I wanted myself like chained to. So
that's cool.
We've never run an ads on the site, and was just designed from the ground up not to require like advertising to be profitable.
So let's switch maybe for a couple of minutes, talk about Pretty Forward. So how does it relate to Forward Everyone, and then what are the differences?
Yeah, so the idea of Forward Everyone was that like stuff, when you share it publicly or within your company, it's kind of meant to live forever essentially, and just be visible either to the general public or else to people within your company. But there's a lot of stuff that you don't necessarily want to live forever, or that doesn't need to. Want to share something with 1 or 2 coworkers, but not have a need to share it with your entire company. So Pretty Forward was built for that use case. So it's completely free. And like the idea is emails are parsed like the same way. So they're super easy to read. They can still be embedded, whatever. But yeah, they don't live forever. Like you can make them expire and you can share them with like just one person or whatever. And the idea also is that Forward Everyone had this very complicated funnel where you need to make an account, and then you need to connect your email address and all this other stuff. So by the time you actually can even share your first email, you've had to do 5 or 10 things before that. Whereas Pretty Forward has 0 funnel. Like you don't need to make an account. Like you literally you install the add-on, you open the add-on, and then you hit share, and that's it. It's basically one click. So yeah, it was also just an experiment to see what our engagement would be like if all of those barriers to using it would be removed. Yeah, and it's, even though it only has, I think as of right now, there's only like 176 people with it installed. Partly I've been working on other stuff since it was launched a few months ago, and just partly I just haven't figured out how to get more people to install it. But the people who haven't installed are actually like using it a lot of them are using it like quite a lot. So I've been like super happy with that. It's a question of how to get more people to install it, which is, I think, is solvable, but yeah, exactly. I have not solved it yet. So it's kind of,
okay. Yeah.
Whatever.
It's a skill. I'm sure you'll get better, and with the business background especially. Have you ever thought of selling either of the projects or?
Yeah, I've thought of it. And it's pretty hard to sell something until like you have actual users. It doesn't, even though the technology is like pretty good and pretty stable at this point. Like the reality is like people don't buy things for the technology, they buy them for the user base. Realistically, until you have like over 100,000 active users, it's just like a non-starter to sell something essentially. So yeah, maybe eventually, who knows? I'm just working on it though. So which is a thing that's kept me going even through like years of like very limited usage. So yeah, hopefully it just turns into the real business that I can run myself, which it actually seems to be on its way to doing, fortunately. Yeah.
I guess I have a couple more questions before we start to wrap up regarding Django. I don't know if you've seen this or you have a feeling about it, but I saw this kind of argument quite a lot, and people have different opinions on this. But function-based use, class-based use, what do you prefer? What do you think is better?
So class-based use, I think it's better with the caveat that like, just because I think class-based use is better because it's easier to read. Essentially, like you've got your get, your post, your put, they're all split up. It's like very easy to see where one starts and one ends and so forth. Where class-based use kind of tends to go wrong is when people start making their classes like inherit all of these properties from like parent classes. And then as soon as that happens, like all of the readability advantages like go away. So my personal philosophy is like use class-based views, but don't have them inherit from like other stuff. That said, if you're a beginner, I think it's fine to use like functional stuff. Like for a lot of people, it's just like easier to understand. And it's if you start with functional views, it's like very easy to rewrite them later. It's not. So.
Okay. I started with class-based
whatever's easier for you.
So never understood. I still have troubles understanding function-based use because there are use cases where you need those, and it's just like a little bit on those. Okay, and for your project, do you self-host or you use any like Heroku type of stuff?
I'm on AWS and Elastic Beanstalk. Yeah, it took a while to learn how to use it, but it's been pretty good. It's been relatively inexpensive, and I think learning AWS is like a good life skill to have. So I'm not.
I agree. Yeah.
Upset at all that I went in that direction.
Yeah. It's not like those frozen sets, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. Right. Where it's like I've used Heroku but yeah, for this, I think AWS was a good.
Sure. Yeah, I currently I tried Heroku once and I couldn't get it, so I failed setting it up. Went with DigitalOcean, dropped it, and so it's just basically Linux. So you have to do all the setup, but they have some good instructions. And yeah, I agree with you that those skills feel like they're good. They're very relatable, and you can use them in other places. Do you have any other things you would like to talk about, or you would like me to ask you?
No.
It's a hard question. I know. I'm sorry.
No, my hope would be that if you check back in 6 months or a year, like the business will actually be making a substantial amount of money, or at least
I would love to do that.
Or it will. Yeah, so I think right now we've got like a handful of, other than like the special projects I mentioned, we've got like a lot of 5 and 10 person companies, and now we're starting to get interest from the 50 to 200 person companies. We'll see how that goes. But
Alex, I would love to do another one. Hopefully it's going to be sooner than 6 months, and you'll be able to share the amazing growth, because Forward Everyone is, I don't want to say old project because it has some sort of negative connotation to it, but you've been working it for a while. I hope it's the point where it's, the growth, exponential growth is at the point where it's very feasible.
Yeah. For bootstrap projects, it's actually the norm for things to take a while. So it's, even though it feels like insane, but that's how it goes.
Okay. Are there any other notes you'd like to give future Django makers? Anything in particular, to help them get started or pushing through?
No, so I mentioned to you, I'm still working on like a blog post about Django architecture that hopefully will be published within the next few months. It's hard because I'm trying to mix business advice with snippets, essentially. I mean, which I think is like super important personally, but it's also pretty difficult. Just from like a writing perspective, because there's not a lot of examples of that being done. Because still like a lot of times business people and code people are like different, but I think it's like important that like people code from like the perspective of like doing things that make sense for the business, I guess. So yeah, I'm trying to push that and experiment with that. It's like a writing style.
It's hard sometimes, I agree, but it's very important. It's just a good thing to do. It adds clarity to yourself. When you go through it, you understand it more, but also it's very helpful for the people. So thank you. I'm personally looking forward to reading that post and seeing what's your perspective on some of the Django stuff. Cool. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for being patient and answering all the questions, all the annoying questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Russell. I appreciate it.
All right.
Okay. Take care.